Spirit is saying to the church. Thanks be to God.
May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I think I'm going to talk about sheep before we talk about the Good Shepherd. I know a little about them. I had a sheep farm in Dawson Creek years ago when I was much younger. And actually, our guest, Bill, had raised sheep at one time as well. So he might, I'm not sure if he'll concur with all of my thoughts about it, but nonetheless. In any event, the sheep that I had in Dawson Creek were a mixed breed. They were bred because of their prolificacy. But I learned a lot about sheep when I visited the person I bought them from. He had a flock of Rambouillets. Now, Rambouillets are a derivative sheep of the merino sheep, and they're very similar and they're the same quality of wool. But what I noticed the first time I went to see his flock of sheep was that as soon as we came near the fence, the sheep flocked together. They all pulled themselves together into a tight ball. There were, I don't know, hundreds of them, and they were just in this big, round, tight ball pressed up against one another. I was very impressed by that. He explained to me that he used to have English sheep, Sussex, Dovers, Hampshires, etc. And he said the problem with the English sheep was that when the predator came near them, they would tend to scatter, whereas the merino sheep and the Rambouillet sheep would come together. So I think it's important to think about sheep behavior in the midst of all of this. The situation in Israel was quite different, however. The sheep weren't herded by dogs, and they weren't pushed out into the pasture. They were led out. And the shepherd would speak to them, and they would know his voice. In fact, the preceding reading from this one that was read this morning talked about the fact that they would hear the shepherd's voice, and if they heard any other voice, they would ignore it. And if anybody else came near them, they would scatter. So the shepherd would, in fact, lead the sheep by voice out into the pasture. I wonder what that causes us to think about. Well, first of all, they must have known him well and known his voice well. And they trusted him. They felt safe with him leading them out into the pasture and being with them throughout the days and nights. And the shepherds, of course, would be very brave in the defense of the sheep. They would fight off wolves and all that sort of thing. So I think when we start to think about the shepherd, the good shepherd, it's important to think about the sheep as well. So the good shepherd is the metaphor for leadership, or the leaders in the church, for example, as Jesus, of course, was our primary metaphor and leader. We want to think about the kind of relationship the shepherd must have with the sheep in order for the sheep to follow his lead. And I think the word relationship is important here as well. Leadership is all about relationship. If you're the kind of leader who people trust, who people respond to in a trusting way, you'll be an effective leader. It may not be due to your personality, it may be due to your style. But if you're truthful and honest, and you're relatable, and you value the relationships you have with those you lead, you'll find yourself working well at what you do, and having your employees or those who follow you work well as well. I think it's important for us to think about leadership in these times. Lots of us complain about the leaders before us, not just bishops and archbishops and so on, but we also complain about the political leaders around us. And part of what happens is that trust breaks down, that the relationship with leaders fails because the relationship isn't nurtured and doesn't seem trustworthy. We hear leaders make us promises, and those promises are often broken. And of course, none of us are perfect. None of us who are clergy, none of us who are in leadership positions at this and that are perfect. But I think if we show ourselves to be the kind of people who are trustworthy, we can lead. And if we have the kinds of relationships with our leaders where trust is the foundational element of the relationship, the leadership, the led and the leader work well together. So I think it's important for us also to think about what kind of sheep we are. Are we like the kind of sheep that scatter, the British sheep, no offense to the British? Or are we like the kind of sheep that flock together, that pull together when there's danger? Do we find ourselves running off in all directions, or do we find ourselves responding by understanding that the community, the gathered people who we trust, and who trust us, are the source of our strength and the source of our safety in dangerous times? We certainly live in dangerous times now. And people have all kinds of opinions about what constitutes that danger. There are people who trust the scientists around COVID and our ways of getting through it. There are people who don't. And so there are going to be all kinds of opinions out there about how to respond to the situation. But I think this lesson this morning, and perhaps the lesson of the Rambouillet and Merino sheep, should help us to understand that no matter what differences we have in opinion, no matter how we see the situation differently, nonetheless, when we pull together in common cause, and that is the mutual safety and protection of one another, that's a much more effective way of responding to danger than to simply have our own thought and run off in a direction and leave the others behind. So leadership in the church is critical at this time as well. We know that, in fact, the church is not in great shape. I don't mean our particular church. I mean, of course, St. Mary's, we're quite wonderful, but, just looking at the church as a whole, numbers are dropping. People are wondering whether or not what we have to offer is relatable, will make any difference in their lives. And, maybe simply by tuning in on Sunday morning here and there, we won't get the full effect of whether or not what we have to offer is relatable and works to the advantage of both individuals and groups. But when we show ourselves to be the kind of sheep that flock and listen to the master's voice, I don't mean mine necessarily, listen to the master's voice, we'll find that we're safer. And not only that, what I've discovered over my years of service in the church is that the stronger the church community is, the more it holds together, the more people are grounded in mutual trust and love, the more attractive it is to the people who are out there perhaps looking for a spiritual home. There's a saying in the 12 steps and 12 traditions of various groups, AA, EA, etc., that our public relations policy is based on attraction rather than promotion. And I think that holds true in the experience of the church. People who come to church in the ages between 18 and 75, studies show, come at the invitation of a friend or family member. And when they're welcomed into the community, when they're made to feel a part of it, they become a part of that trusting group that we call church. And the words for church, as some of you may or may not know, especially the word for church that most occurs in the New Testament, really means the gathering or the gathered people. It means people who gather in common cause and for the sake of one another and the sake of all and for the common good. And it also, the other word that's often used for church means community. The church is a community. So the more that we are understood to be a community of people who come together for mutual love and mutual support, the more attractive we will be to people who are lonely, to people who don't have a spiritual life that nurtures them, to people who want to have a sense of belonging and a sense of common cause. And we don't have to all have the same opinions. I had a parishioner in Castlegar years ago who came to a sort of an Anglican 101 course that I gave, and there were a lot of new people there. So we were sort of asking, why are you an Anglican? And this fellow said, well, I'm an Anglican because I can think what I want and have whatever opinion I want and still feel a part of it, still feel like I belong, still feel like I'm loved and accepted. The Good Shepherd that we celebrate this Sunday, Jesus, wasn't someone who was about his own ego. He wasn't about social advancement. He wasn't trying to be a member of the elite. In fact, he gave up his life. He willingly went to the cross to be continually authentic, to not be hypocritical, but to take what he said and what he believed and what he taught to the point of even being willing to lose his life, his physical life, for the sake of others. And perhaps that example is about not being afraid to stand up for what we believe, not being afraid to stand up for people who are different than ourselves, to be afraid to stand up for people who the rest of society leaves out, to support the homeless, the lonely, the addicted, those who don't have adequate food, clothing, and shelter. Jesus did. He stood up for the people who are marginalized in his community. He stood up for the homeless, the beggars. He stood up for the prostitutes, the drunkards, those who everybody else considered sinners. And so if we're going to follow the Good Shepherd, who's willing to sacrifice on our behalf, we need to be people who sacrifice on behalf of others. In that reading, it also said that there are other sheep who aren't a part of this fold. They can be included as well. Not included if they simply say the right things or make the pronouncements correctly. Not included because they appeal to have the same thoughts that we have, the same ideas that we have, but included because of their need for community, their need for love, and their need for support. And that love, that support, that sense of belonging is far more powerful than anything I could say in a sermon. Far more powerful than saying something magical about Jesus. What's powerful is to be Christ in the midst of all. Dietrich Bonhoeffer talked about that not long before he died. He said, if you want to find Christ, look at the person in ragged clothes. Look at the person who's struggling for a meal. Look at the person who's homeless, who's been betrayed, who's been left out. And there you'll find Christ. And love and serve that person, because that person also sacrificed for the sake of those who didn't have, who were alone, and who were marginalized. So in this Good Shepherd Sunday, which is often referred to as Vocation Sunday, we need to think not about simply the vocation of clergy or prospective clergy. We need to think about our vocation as people who are made in the image and likeness of God and who follow Jesus, who was willing to give up everything for the sake of what he believed in and what he trusted and what his commission and sense of journey was about. And so sacrifice means sometimes, that we might do with less for the sake of others. I've noticed, by the way, that I seem to have enough to stay roughly 15 pounds overweight on a continuous basis. So I think that we can all stand to be the kind of community that reaches out, not just with word, but in deed, to love the people around us, to welcome immigrants, to welcome refugees, to welcome those who have no society, no family, no community. In order to do that, we need to be those who are strengthened by the leadership of the Good Shepherd. We need to flock together. We need to trust one another. We need to love one another, even when it's difficult, even when we don't understand. Above all, we need to accept one another. We need to accept the community we are exactly as it is and be who we're called to be in this world. The Good Shepherd sheds his voice to us in Scripture, in song. Let's hear his voice, and let's be that community that responds to the world around us in how we present ourselves as community, how we treat one another and how we treat others. And let's draw others into a community of love, not making them make creedal statements, not making them give over what they already believe for something else, but to love them as our primary force of evangelism and good news and outreach. Amen. Spend a moment in silence. Don't forget to breathe.